My name is Leslie Macara. I am the Professor of Penology in the Law School, and I'm also the Director of the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Edinburgh. I'm really delighted to welcome you all to this fourth in the 2023 Gifford Lectures series. So it is my very great pleasure to welcome Professor John Dupré again as he continues his Gifford series on the theme, A Process Perspective on Human Life. Now, I know that Professor Dupré is really well known to many of you in the audience, and he's been very generously giving his time also to students on the blog that's been going across this lecture series too. So I know that some of the students have had engagement with him through that. He is a highly distinguished philosopher of science, globally renowned, and his Gifford series is exploring many of the fundamental questions about human life and what it means to be human. And he's conceptualizing this as a constantly dynamic set of processes with implications for understanding of things like personal identity, free will, and many other aspects of humankind. So in doing so, I think his series really brilliantly fulfills the original ambition of the Gifford Lectures, which was to promote and diffuse the study of natural theology in its widest sense of the term. And there's something about this lecture series that traverses many different disciplines. So people are coming to these questions from different disciplinary backgrounds, which makes it extremely exciting in my view. So this evening, we will hear the fourth of John's 6 lectures entitled Personal Identity, and there'll be an opportunity at the end of the lecture to ask Professor Dupré any questions that you may have that arise from his lecture tonight, and we'll have a short break between the lecture and the questioning to let anybody who needs to leave early to go before the questioning. So may I invite you now, John, to give this evening's lecture. Welcome again.
Thank you very much for that very nice introduction. Whatever the problems in saying what the boundaries of the organism might be at a time, or the boundaries in time of a stage in an organism, we cannot entirely avoid a question about the persistence of the human organism through time. What makes me the same person as a child who existed several decades ago? My starting point for addressing this question is a position that has recently been defended as animalism. The continuity of a person over time is just the continuity of a certain kind of animal. The position is, however, substantially modified when combined with the view that an animal, human or otherwise, is a process. In this lecture, I shall elaborate this synthesis, which I describe as processual animalism. I shall further consider what implications this position might have for ideas of personal responsibility and for the possibility of immortality. I did touch on that last time, some of you will remember. What is it for a person to persist over time? This is an ancient philosophical question. The traditional puzzle can be introduced by way of John Locke's tale of the prince and the cobbler, a thought experiment that can be found in various forms in literature and more recently film. Locke imagines a prince waking up in his palace with all the memories, beliefs, and consciousness of a cobbler. A cobbler wakes up in his modest hovel with the memories and consciousness of the prince. The cobbler believes and declares that he is really the prince. He feels as if he has just woken up in an alien body in a highly unfamiliar environment. Similarly for the prince, though he may be less insistent on his true person. Note that there is no uncontentious way of telling this story. I have told it in what might be described as a third-person way, as it would appear to the prince's valet when he wakes the prince in the morning to discover that he has gone mad, or to the family of the cobbler, for whom the nonsense will also be fraught with danger. But there is a perhaps more standard first-person perspective. From this point of view, we imagine the prince waking up and finding he is in a wretched hovel and his appearance has changed dramatically. The second description is the one that people generally find more intuitively plausible, and indeed, this is the one urged on us by Locke. We can imagine, or think we can, waking up in a different body. Intuitively, we are mostly Cartesian dualists. We think of our minds as independent from, and in principle, even detachable from, the bodies in which they reside. But I originally introduced the story in a quite different way. Two people have gone mad. Only the co-occurrence of the two transformations makes this story less plausible. Otherwise, if solely a cobbler wakes up and declares that he is a prince who has migrated into this body from somewhere or other, we think he has gone mad. Indeed, thinking one is Jesus Christ or Napoleon is a familiar, if extreme, form of psychosis. As traditionally interpreted, this problem can be seen as the question, one thing or two. Locke's view, drawing on the common intuitions about the prince and the cobbler, is that identity is constituted by consciousness and memory. This inheres in something distinct from the physical body, a mind or soul. Materialists reject such a dualism and insist that mental properties such as memory inhere in the physical body. While my sympathies lie more with the latter view, I shall take a rather different approach. The story does anyhow helpfully distinguish the two main traditional approaches to the question of personal identity, the question what it is for a person to persist over time. On one very natural view, exemplified by Locke, memory of one's past experiences provide the feature of the present individual that links him or her to the person who had those experiences. The alternative view, recently increasing in popularity, is that it is the human body that determines identity regardless of any psychological discontinuities. I just noted the idea that the question might come down to whether there is one thing or two in a human person. In my view, there is not one thing or two, but none. The human is a process, not a thing. So much of this lecture will concern questions about how we identify and individuate processes. I hope that this will cast somewhat novel light on the ancient debate. I begin with two very general points, one negative, one positive. The negative point is that there is no a priori limit to how much change there can be in the lifetime of a process. I said in an earlier lecture that there was a lineage, a process, leading from Luca, the last universal common ancestor, to the contemporary human species. This was not a claim about any resemblance we as humans might have to an ancient and primitive cell. Positively, the reason why this may nonetheless count as a process is that each stage in it is causally connected to the next. I don't assume in saying this that there is any objectively given decomposition of a process into particular stages. Rather, it is just that however we draw a distinction between stages, there are causal links that lead from the earlier to the later stages. But how we demarcate an individual within such an extended process is substantially underdetermined. This already suggests a view that I shall defend today. The problem of personal identity is overstated. The phenomenon it aims to understand, the existence of a unique individual over a specific length of time, is much less clear than is normally supposed. In elaborating this view, I start, as mentioned, with an increasingly popular materialistic theory of personal identity, animalism. I shall then reinterpret this view in the light of my processual commitments. A poster for a conference on animalism a few years ago described the position thus: according to animalism, our fundamental nature is given not by our psychological capacities, but by our biological constitution. We are primates, Homo sapiens, and like all organisms, we persist just in case we continue living. I'm generally sympathetic to animalism as thus described. I agree that we are members of the species, Homo sapiens, and that we persist as long as we continue to live. My reservations concern mainly the fundamental nature. Fundamental nature here relates to a widely held philosophical picture of persistence. For a thing to be a possible subject of persistence, on this view, it must be a thing of a certain kind. It persists so long as it continues to satisfy the conditions for being a thing of that kind, but no longer. The conditions are the essence, the fundamental nature of the kind. Thus, Pace Kafka, it is impossible to turn into a beetle. Although this is certainly a theory devised to understand the persistence of things, I will not hold that against it. The problem for biological entities such as organisms is that whether they are things or processes, there is no such essence or fundamental nature. As noted in a previous lecture, any two species can be connected by a series of species comprising the lineage of each traced back to a common ancestor. Very many properties will change throughout this sometimes very long trajectory. Why should we count one or a specific set of these as the essence, the sine qua non of a species existing at any particular time? There is a serious dilemma confronted by such a choice. An essence should be a property possessed by all and only the members of a species. All is easy enough to satisfy. All humans have hearts, brains, livers, etc., for example. But so do all vertebrates, probably. Only humans have flown to the moon or written a novel, but most humans have done neither. A property of all and only humans is much harder to find. The variation known to exist within the species, and incidentally a condition of evolution by natural selection, makes it very likely that there is no such property. Suppose, as is in fact widely accepted, we think the human species is defined by the reproductive relations between its members, actual and possible. Some philosophers have recently proposed that we allow relational essences, or more specifically to the present question, historical essences, a series of reproductive links to an ancestral population. The problem with this is that it is a strictly relational property, and if anything follows about the intrinsic properties of the related members of the species, it does so only contingently. But an essence is generally supposed to provide a property necessarily true of any member of a kind, that is, true of all and only members of the kind. And in the present context, it is a property of the individual that is supposed to determine the persistence of the individual. When a human dies, or for that matter, is transmuted into a porcupine, they do not persist as a human, but they do not then cease to have been born of human parents. So no guidance is provided for our question about persistence. The unlimited change within a lineage makes it difficult to define an essential property for an individual qua member of a lineage. But the nature of individual biological development presents comparably difficult problems. Consider the life cycle of a beetle through egg, larva, pupa, and adult. What property do these stages have in common that constitutes them as parts of the same life cycle? One might imagine that the genome provided an answer, but genes mutate, recombine, and change in various ways all the time. Any attempt to find an essential feature of the genome is likely to face the same problem in applying both to all and to only members of the species. The sorts of changes that would prevent the continued life cycle of the organism are the kinds of genetic features that will be strongly stabilized by selection and thus likely to occur in many related organisms. Features unique to the species are unlikely to be universal within the species. It's time to move away from conceptions of identity honed specifically for a world of things and consider more directly what it is for a process to remain the same process over time. In one sense, persistence just is not a problem for processes. That is just what they do. Recalling the definition of animalism above, if an organism does enough to stay alive, it persists. There is no particular requirement of similarity between stages of a process, hence no question for appeal to essence to answer. A second point that has appeared at several points in these lectures is that it should not be assumed that there is a unique way of delineating processes. If we see life as consisting of more or less stabilized patterns maintained in an enormously complex flow of living activity, then there may well be different persisting patterns to distinguish. I've noted the options of including or excluding microbial symbionts from the definition of a multicellular organism. An ant may be considered an independent individual or a constituent of the much larger hive process. I have in the past referred to this freedom to define individuals in various ways as promiscuous individualism. To elaborate the point, think of the process made famous by Heraclitus, a river. What's the difference between a river and a tributary, and when is the latter part of the former? The combination of the lower Mississippi and the Missouri is considerably longer than what is now referred to as the Mississippi, but the latter carries more water. Either factor might very well have been taken as a defining characteristic, though in fact it seems that the decision reflects historical contingency. From the Treaty of Paris in 1763, the Mississippi served as the boundary between the British and Spanish empires, whereas Meriwether Lewis and William Clark in 1804 were the first Europeans to travel the length of the Missouri. The Mississippi was surely more salient to European settlers at the time that these nomenclatural decisions became established. The philosophical point, at any rate, is just that there is surely no difference of kind between the two candidates for being the river and the two candidates for being tributaries, the Missouri and the upper Mississippi. There are many further questions that might be asked in such a context. How big must a stream flowing into a river be to be a tributary? What are the differences between a stream, a creek, a brook, or a river? If a river widens to become a lake, is it still also a river? When does the lake begin? I take it that none of these questions is answered by nature, though we may, if we wish, stipulate precise definitions. It's also surely possible, perhaps likely, that hydrologists, cartographers, water engineers, and hikers may make different distinctions. The encompassing process is the drainage of a certain area of land to the sea. The parts of it, rivers, streams, lakes, tributaries, distributaries, and so on, are ways of distinguishing parts of this process to serve our various interests in the process. We might also ask where the river begins. The Mississippi River is said to begin as a trickle floating out of Lake Itasca in northern Minnesota. Is there some fact that determines this point, this starting point? Surely not. Why should it not run through Lake Itasca, as it does, for instance, through Lake Winnibigoshish? The importance of this question harks back to my discussion of pregnancy in the last lecture. We should not assume that the beginning of an individual process is a matter of objective fact, either for a river or for an animal. We have reasons for defining these beginnings, and different concerns may lead us to name different sections of a process. There is no biological answer to the question when a person comes into being. Conception is where two processes intersect, and the intersection is surely consequential. But just as the confluence of the Mississippi and the Missouri, we may say either ends and the other continues, or two entirely new rivers begin, so with a life. The egg precedes fertilization, and we could perfectly well trace the human life back to the formation of that egg cell. If we want to address the ethical, social, and political questions about what rights we reasonably attribute to a developing and unborn human and to a mature female human when these conflict, we should not look to biology for an answer. Similar questions arise with regard to processes of many kinds. Sometimes a difference of degree is sufficient to become a difference in kind. In meteorology, we distinguish a tropical disturbance which, as wind speeds increase, becomes a tropical depression, a tropical storm, and finally a hurricane. Indeed, whether it is termed a hurricane, a typhoon, or a cyclone depends only on what body of water it originated in. In biology, distinctions tend to be more complex. Consider, again, the lineage. Any biological lineage can be traced all the way to Luca, the last universal common ancestor. Along this journey, we distinguish it into many kinds which increasingly deserve to be called species. Are the decisions between these species an objective matter? I think not. If one is a cladist, then there is a necessary condition, being a branch point in the tree, that the origin of a new species must meet. But how big a branch? A small band of animals go and live alone on an island, evolve a little, and die out. Must we rename the originating species? I really don't think so. In practice, most taxonomists are unlikely to accept the necessary condition without qualification. If a species exists for eons without branching but undergoes major changes, most will acknowledge the possibility of so-called anagenetic speciation speciation within a non-branching lineage, as opposed to the cladogenetic speciation championed by the strictest cladists. And then think of an organism. The life cycle of an organism is a single process, but we are not obligated to say that at every stage of the life cycle we have the same kind. The egg is part of the same process as the tadpole and the frog, but arguably they constitute a series of different entities. An egg hatches into a tadpole. It is not a tadpole. And there are other distinctions that apply within an organism's life cycle. Large predatory fish can lay millions of eggs. The eggs and the tiny fish that hatch from them are prey from the perspective of their parents, who are as likely to eat them as they are any other organism of similar size. The point where a prey animal grows into a predator is vague. Most organisms are prey for some species, predators for others, and their relations can change over the life cycle. But this is nonetheless a distinction without which the science of population ecology would be impossible. So let us return to human processes. An immediate thought is that this talk of rivers and fish is all of marginal relevance to the human case. Apart from the question of symbionts, a bit about which one might plausibly not care one way or another for everyday purposes, the uniqueness and continuity of a human person is not contentious. People are born, named, given various identifying numbers, and tracked throughout their lives by various bureaucracies until their deaths are certified. There is no underdetermined decision to be made as to whether I am the same person as one John Dupré who grew up in southern England in the middle of the last century. The question is just what this means. Identity over time is simply a given. There is undoubtedly a process that leads from fertilized egg through embryo and fetus to baby, child, teenager, and so on to death. Similarly, there is a process that leads from Luca to the human species. Here we say there is one process, the lineage, but many different species ordered temporally along the lineage. In the human case, we may say that the embryo, fetus, baby, and so on form one human life cycle. One might think that the move to the person was just what animalism should suggest. An animal is, I hold a life cycle. But that can't be quite right, as this would imply that the zygote was a person. Now, this might be acceptable from some religious perspectives in which fertilization of the egg is a moment of ensoulment. But for the animalist who believes that the human is only an animal, surely this is too early for the animal to become a person. The concept of a person is generally connected with psychological properties such as memory and consciousness and legal status, such as citizenship or bearer of rights and duties. None of these makes much sense in relation to a single cell. So here we've identified a major qualification of animalism. We cannot identify the human person with the human animal unless we are willing to accept that the zygote and every subsequent stage of the human life cycle is a person. Perhaps we shall have to bite this bullet, but we've already seen that the logic of process does not require it. Generally, and more formally, if some part of a process of kind A is also a process of kind B, it does not follow that every part of the process is of kind B. And incidentally, this innocuous principle is also true of things if there are any. My copy of Plato's complete works is currently a doorstop. It will no longer be one when the role is taken over by a copy of Principia Mathematica. If there are things, I suppose books are things. It is, of course, a hugely controversial matter of debate at what point a fetus becomes a person with rights. Ronald Reagan once claimed that unless and until it can be proven that the unborn child is not a living entity, then its right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness must be protected. I think we can safely concede that the unborn human is a living entity, though child is a far more controversial description. But we should certainly not accept that every living entity has a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We can debate whether these rights extend to pigs and chickens. But if we grant them to carrots, cauliflower, and even cholera bacterial, we will be revoking our own right to exist. So, if designating a process as an X and thereby legitimating judgments of distinct parts of a process as the same X is recognized as a pragmatic decision answerable to particular human goals, what are the relevant goals for calling a part of the human life cycle a person? Why, in other words, do we individuate humans at all? Answers to this question are not hard to find. To begin with, we humans individuate one another for organizational purposes, for the distribution of responsibility and rights essential for the functioning of the complicated structures that support the very large populations of humans. Here we see a major difference from the much simpler division of labor in an ant colony. When a pheromone trail directs foragers to a food source, it seems unlikely that it matters which particular foragers follow the trail. We assume they are pretty much fully interchangeable. Human workers have more specific and differentiated occupations. A human is not merely a retail worker, but one who works at a particular store on the early morning shift. Having retail workers show up at any convenience store at any arbitrary time would probably not be a successful way of managing the goods distribution function. Other aspects of human societies require, for instance, that the same individual who acquires a debt or orders a product is the one who must pay the debt or expects to receive the product. This is managed by uniquely individuating humans and doing so through often quite complex practices of re-identifying them. There is, of course, also a more private, as we say, personal or personalized dimension to all this. First of all, individual humans do appear to have a special concern for what happens to themselves, something they may even share with the worker ants, though we could debate this. Interestingly, nonetheless, we do not universally applaud this concern. Selfishness is considered a moral flaw, though a complicated one, as we generally acknowledge that to some degree it is not only expected, but perhaps even deserves our approbation. More importantly, perhaps, selfishness is a highly variable feature of humans. In contemporary capitalist societies where selfishness is expected and sometimes even applauded, some individuals seem surprisingly deficient in this character trait. Moreover, it is plausible, though not always easy to assess, that in many other historical and perhaps even contemporary societies, selfishness was either unusual or perhaps even unimaginable. Humans generally have strong bonds of affection to specific other humans, especially family members. Perhaps, as many evolutionary theorists argue, the bonds to family are a deep part of our biology. There is no doubt that such bonds are part of our natural history, though there is a good deal of disagreement concerning how this aspect of our biology is sustained. It's hardly news that family relations are sometimes irreparably broken. Still more controversial in terms of evolutionary origin, but no less indisputable is the capacity, albeit highly variable, of humans to form a network of bonds beyond the immediate family. At any rate, the network of personal relations that most people value, familiar or otherwise, is based on individuality. Relations are with specific, not easily replaceable individuals. Most of us would be unhappy if random strangers regularly showed up for family dinner rather than the familiar loved ones, though it is not an impossible ideal that we might come to welcome such strangers as warmly as our relatives. So, while a part of the importance of our continued identity as persons may be an expression of our biology, notably in the parental care typical of many societies organized into family groups, a large part of this importance is also social. We have complex and pervasive technologies, the entire point of which is to track personal identity. We all, or almost all, have names and social security numbers. Most of us have telephone numbers, email addresses, and a totally unmanageable number of passwords for accessing our internet spaces. We issue birth certificates, death certificates, identity cards, and passports. Many of us now carry quite sophisticated face recognition and fingerprint identification technologies in our pockets. If you believe that you have an individual essence or a unique soul, then these technologies are merely reflections of the contingent impossibility of disclosing our essence or our soul. But if, as I've tried to persuade you, you are a process constantly changing and with no clear limits to the possibility of change, you should see these technologies as contributing to the construction of identity, rather than merely tracking something that pre-exists. Of course, I don't deny that the human animal has a life cycle that coincides in part with the life history of a person. This is the clear attraction of the animalist account of personal identity. But my question was why we decide to track a person through a very large part of this process, typically from birth, when names are given, and the first identity-determining paperwork is issued. This seems so natural as to be inevitable, but surely it isn't. Imagine a society of intelligent frogs. Female frogs, let's imagine, deposit a predetermined number of eggs in the communal pool. Teachers and carers look after the tadpoles, and when these turn into frogs, they're given names and social roles. A frog, one imagines, would have no great interest in the tadpole, still less egg, from which it emerged. But we don't need to fantasize about intelligent frogs. Human life is already more variable than those of us who have internalized and naturalized Euro-American culture assume. Consider the distinction between what the anthropologist of childhood, David Lancy, calls pick-when-ripe cultures and pick-when-green cultures. So I quote, "In the pick-when-ripe culture, babies and toddlers are largely ignored by adults and may not be named until they are weaned. They undergo a village curriculum, running errands, delivering messages, and doing small-scale versions of adult tasks. Only later are they picked or fully recognized as individuals. In contrast, in pick-when-green cultures, including our own, it's never too early to socialize babies or recognize their personhood." Lancy proposes that the pick-when-green culture emerged in the Netherlands in the 17th century as a reflection of radical Protestantism and was imported to the English-speaking world by John Locke. These children are the cherubs in the title of the book, The Anthropology of Childhood, Cherubs, Chattel, Changelings. Despite the discomfort they may cause modern Western readers, the other two C words better reflect historical and cross-cultural norms. In relation to my present concerns, the point is more modest. It is neither universal nor even culturally typical that personhood begins at birth, or, for that matter, as in some radical versions of Christianity, long before birth. Again, the point is reinforced that personhood is a concept imposed on the animal life cycle for variable parts of the life cycle and reflecting wider social interests. These reflections may well be seen as something of a debunking of personal identity, and I think that is correct. There is a process, part of an animal life cycle, that led to whatever I am today. What relation should I feel to past stages of that process? Perhaps I should feel pride in the achievements of a past self and shame for my misdeeds. But is this very different from the pride or shame I feel in the achievements of my friends and family? I like to be associated with good things and not with bad things. Here I converge on conclusion reached, admittedly for very different reasons, by the late Derek Parfit. Parfit doesn't think that personal identity is important. Parfit thinks, like Locke, that what matters is the connection between one's present experience and one's memories. But he doesn't think that this is enough to ground an interesting relation of personal identity. There are parts of my life about which I remember very little. Unless I decide to write an autobiography, the person who experienced this life stage will be of no special interest to me. Parfit finds the unimportance of personal identity liberating. He writes that when he believed that personal identity was what mattered, he was much more concerned by the inevitability of his death. He writes, "After my death, there will be no one living who will be me. I can now re-describe this fact. Though there will later be many experiences, none of these experiences will be connected to my present experiences by chains of such direct connections as those involved in experience memory or in the carrying out of an earlier intention. Some of these future experiences may be related to my present experiences in less direct ways. There will later be some memories about my life, and there may later be thoughts that are influenced by mine or things done as the result of my advice. My death will break the more direct relations between my present experiences and future experiences, but it will not break various other relations. This is all there is to the fact that there will be no one living who will be me. Now that I've seen this, my death seems to me less bad. Certainly, my past can have consequences for my present self. If an earlier stage of my animal life cycle had written a best-selling book, perhaps I would still be receiving royalties from it. And if it had committed heinous crimes, I might still be held responsible and punished. But the latter case is an interesting one. There is a strong and very understandable sentiment in favor of holding octogenarian former war criminals accountable after many decades. But there is surely also an element of discomfort in such actions. The octogenarian may have spent his life doing good works in an effort to repay his moral debt. The worry is not, perhaps, that he has repaid the debt. The lives of hundreds or thousands of victims cannot be restored. It is that the person now living may now actually be a morally admirable person. This could, of course, be debated. Perhaps if he had achieved moral excellence, he would long ago have turned himself in for his earlier crimes. But whatever the upshot of the discussion, there is surely no doubt that this is a very different situation from arresting someone red-handed in the commission of their ghastly crimes. The relation to once distant precursors is more complex than mere identity. Let me mention one more reason why I think it would be very beneficial to diminish the importance we attach to personal identity over long periods of time. One of the most serious problems of our time is the obscene and rapidly increasing inequality between people in most countries of the world. Some of this derives from the ways to which I've already alluded that people are considered entitled to what are judged to be the fruits of their labor. But the ratchet that keeps inequality increasing are the chains of entitlement that run through human lives and then are passed on to offspring. Many of the grossly rich are so because an ancestor several years back became, or several generations back, became rich, perhaps in his or her youth. The vehicle that carries wealth from the events that made this ancestor rich to the current plutocrat is the absolute identity of persons carrying absolute rights to property. If one relaxed the absoluteness of identity, one would naturally also relax the absoluteness of these rights, and it would be difficult or impossible to justify the extension of these not merely to the end of life, but beyond through rights of inheritance. The heritocracy, as this dysfunctional grounding of inequality is sometimes known, is an extreme expression of the individualism that has been an occasional target throughout these lectures. The quote above from Parfit also points to a weakening of the primacy of the individual in favor of a clearer recognition of the profoundly social nature of our species. In addition to the dependence of the individual on countless other humans, every human is a member of a range of more or less significant social wholes: families, villages, tribes, armies, nations, universities, bridge clubs, gangs, and so on. Often, the individual is better understood as part of such a whole than as an individual process. Recalling the hierarchy of processes that constitute the living world and the ways in which processes are stabilized both by their parts and by the wholes of which they are parts, we should not let the concern with our own status as individuatable processes lead us to overlook other processes of often even greater significance. Picking up on Parfit's remarks on mortality and the consolation of philosophy, let me end with a brief reflection on a topic that has attained some prominence recently. In fact, in my last lecture, I touched on it, the possibility of, if not immortality, at least a massive extension of the duration of life. The traditional conception of human immortality supposes the human essence to reside in the soul, a substance wholly different from the human body that we know to be so sadly perishable. I must admit that I do not fully understand this doctrine. I must also confess that if it is true, then much of what I have said today is false. The soul is, I suppose, an immutable substance, and it has an essence, a category of which I have been highly skeptical. I will not anyhow consider this possibility any further here. Perhaps an unusual way into the topic of immortality is to recall the chapter of Richard Dawkins' famous book, The Selfish Gene, entitled Immortal Coils, which argues for the immortality of genes. Tempting though it is to have some fun with the appeal to immortality by such a notorious atheist, fairness to Dawkins requires me to note that the immortality in question is the immortality, or considerable longevity, as we should surely more accurately describe it, of gene lineages, processes in which the material genes are constantly copied and replaced rather than gene individuals. And this provides a valuable reminder that the persistence of processes differs in many significant ways from the persistence of things. Somewhat parallel to Dawkins' account of the life of a gene, there is a relatively uncontroversial sense in which one might achieve immortality through one's offspring. This is not so different from the immortality that Aristotle, Shakespeare, or Einstein may attain through their works. The world in the distant future may contain an identifiable causal trace of one's existence. This is also part of what Parfit refers to in his more sanguine view of mortality. But although it is something some people may care deeply about, it is hardly to be confused with the idea that the very process which constitutes one's life might exist for a long period after one's death. The difference has been succinctly stated by Woody Allen. I don't want to achieve immortality through my work. I want to achieve immortality through not dying. I don't want to live on in the hearts of my countrymen. I want to live on in my apartment. More exciting for those who find themselves dissatisfied with the brevity of the human lifespan are the pronouncements of some who believe that medical science will soon be able to overcome the diseases of old age and to extend our lifespan by an order of magnitude. This seems to be an especially pressing concern for some of the multi-billionaires I've occasionally referred to, some of whom fund this research. Perhaps they feel it to be unjust that their riches do not yet suffice to buy immortality. If one thinks of the human organism as an object or machine subject to deterioration, this is at least a reasonable aspiration. It is characteristic of the machine view of the organism that one thinks of a period of development, a stable period of mature function, and a period of decay. The objective is to maintain the machine in the middle phase by counteracting the various causes of decay or malfunction. Protection from sources of damage and repair or replacement of seriously damaged components should, in principle, enable the machine to be maintained indefinitely. However, recognizing the human organism as a kind of process makes this story considerably more problematic. One worry concerns the possibly confused motivation for seeking many centuries of life. Processes do not persist by sustaining an unchanging and potentially immortal essence, but rather by the continuity and interconnectedness of the activities that maintain them. So does it even make sense for me to be concerned about the existence in 1,000 years of some person whose connection to me is merely historical, with whom I have little or nothing in common beyond mere shared participation in a continuous process? I've questioned the significance of identity between a living adult and some dimly recalled child many decades earlier. One may equally doubt the possibility of, for a child, really to imagine that they will one day be an old person, and the consequent dubiousness of supposing the child to have any real concern with the coming to be of any such geriatric. The concern of myself today with the future existence of someone processually continuous with me in the distant future, but who will long ago have forgotten the thoughts, concerns, and memories that now absorb me, is an extreme scenario for similar doubts. It is true that I can imagine that there will be someone who shares my social security number and has the same name as me on my passport. But why should I care about this? This relates to a further problem, which I mentioned briefly in my first lecture. As I have insisted, the human, as an animal, is fundamentally a life cycle. Stabilizing one temporal stage of the life cycle, one hopes a relatively youthful one, for a period many times the current lifespan of the entire cycle, would be to create a fundamentally different kind of being. As the procedures envisaged for life's extension are often difficult and dangerous, it is perhaps likely that they will not be undertaken until natural life is almost exhausted, leading rather to the familiar objection that the outcome of these efforts will be a dystopian world populated entirely by the very aged. In the worst case, the aging process continues, modified only by the absence of death, so the degree of antiquity reached is something beyond our current imagination. Some transhumanists who promote the search for immortality have an idea that at least evades these worries. They embrace the rather repulsive parody of Cartesian dualism, in which we continue our eternal lives as programs in computers, certainly a more radical ontological shift away from a living process. The sense in which I, a material animal, would be continuing my existence as code or programs running in silicon chips does, I must confess, elude me. It is perhaps not entirely different from the thought that I might continue my existence as a stream of consciousness in an immaterial substance. But since both strike me as impossible, I feel comfortable ignoring the former. Even if such a thing could exist, the ontological disjuncture between what we are and what it is supposed we might become strongly suggests the impossibility of continuity of process between the two. Let me return to the ontologically less bizarre proposals for material persistence for millennia. As I've stressed from the outset, for a persistent process such as a human, a question that can always be raised is what maintains its more or less stable structure. As I have also mentioned, the stability of an organism is, in Waddington's terms, homeoretic rather than homeostatic. A specific trajectory rather than a steady state is what is maintained. This is the kind of process illustrated by Waddington's famous diagrams showing a ball rolling down a valley. The slopes on either side of the valley represent the processes that keep the ball in the valley. Dysfunctions, for example, if we think of this as a human life cycle, might explain such things as cancer and could be represented by one of the branching valleys. And healthy or unhealthy modes of behavior or dietary intakes could be thought of as changing the contours at the point where the valleys meet in ways that affect the likelihood of the ball changing path. In this model, then, it is easy to understand how appropriate interventions could maximize the chances of staying on the healthy developmental path for the full lifespan. That is what medicine attempts to do. But a ball cannot roll downhill forever, and likewise, it is not obvious that the developmental trajectory of a human can be extended forever. I do not want to argue here that this is demonstrably impossible. However, the misguided analogy with maintenance of a machine makes the plausibility of indefinite life extension much less problematic than would a more accurate picture of a process with a characteristic trajectory and a typical temporal duration. Let me conclude. As I have stressed throughout this and earlier lectures, processes do not divide the world in the precise, countable way expected of things. And though we do not generally see the individuations of humans into distinct persons as a deep practical problem, questions about when personhood begins or what it would be to extend it indefinitely in the future do raise indeterminacies that are not present in the world of substance. But perhaps the real enlightenment provided by process ontology is the recognition of the interweaving and mutual stabilization of processes of which the human animal provides an outstanding illustration. A human is in part a cell lineage, a functional living system, a psychological subject, and a part of many social wholes. Which of these must persist if the human person is to persist? I'm skeptical whether we can give answers to this question that are more than pragmatic solutions to particular problems. Thank you very much.